He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Just a quick warning, this podcast contains strong language and descriptions of violence some listeners might find confronting. On the 25th of July 1985, Ross Appelgren's life changed forever when he was given a life sentence for murdering Darcy Tahira.
My head was buzzing with disbelief, shock and anger.
Ross had to try and settle himself in Parimoremo, not a place known for providing shoulders to cry on.
You learn in jail to hide your feelings, but I was well aware of the ridicule, jokes and disbelief I would face myself when I claimed to be innocent. In prison, to say I'm innocent or not guilty is to invite knowing nods all around. How often I'd heard those phrases in jail, and how often I'd joined in the groans of disbelief.
By now, you've heard the main evidence presented at Ross's trial, and all the key information not given to the jury. That included police assurances to Ernie he'd not go back to jail, his motel stay, trips away, and those remarkable pardon discussions with the Justice Department. It always struck me as unusual how comprehensively police documented Ernie's time during Operation Icing. Well, it's because they'd anticipated Ross's lawyers would argue Ernie had received inducements to testify, and police wanted to be
in a position to account for everything Ernie's been doing in Christchurch since 18 June 1985 when he arrived from Auckland.
As well, police wrote up a statement for a senior officer who could tell the jury
Ernie has repeatedly requested assurances as to his future after he has given evidence in the present proceedings. The police and justice officials have consistently told him that his future will not be discussed until after he has given his evidence and the trial is completed.
But the jury never heard that statement, nor did they get to read those police reports because the cops kept it all to themselves. The reason? Well, apparently it was because the defence didn't seek to exclude Ernie's evidence based on inducements. The day after Ernie testified, Head Detective Peter Jenkinson's assessment of a star witness was quoted in a police report.
He performed very well, apparently, and came up to brief. There was no voir dire and very little cross-examination as regards his accommodation in Christchurch. He was only asked where he'd been, and he responded by saying that he had been in custody and looked after by police and prison officers.
But of course, how could Ross's lawyer, Mary Beth Sharp, fully cross-examine Ernie about his pre-trial deals when she was not given the information? Even 4 years after the trial, in this 1989 Radio Pacific interview with Tim Bickerstaff, Sharp still only had a belief, but no proof.
Was there a deal struck?
Well, I'm certain there was. There must have been.
It looks to me, at least, that the police were effectively playing a game of poker when it came to what evidence they presented at Ross's trial. But I also suspect there was another reason they didn't show all their cards, particularly that statement.
The police and justice officials have consistently told him that his future will not be discussed until after he has given his evidence.
Because they knew it wasn't true. You're listening to Nark, an RNZ investigative podcast. I'm your host, Mike Wesley-Smith. This is episode 9, Appeal. Ross, sitting in a cell in Parry, with no idea of all the information withheld from his defence team, was nonetheless determined to have his guilty verdict overturned. But it wasn't going to be easy.
Every day or two, certain staff members and crims would make the usual jokes. Thought you would be out by now, Ross. How's your appeal going, mate? And when are you going home, pal? When there had been no progress for months, were particularly hard to take. And though most remarks were made in jest, there was the odd vicious stab, and that cut pretty deep at times.
Ross's lawyer Mary Beth Sharp, though, was working hard behind the scenes. She got a boost when police finally provided her with Ernie's full police statement dated the 22nd of February 1985. This was the basis for his trial testimony, though importantly, there were key details in his statement Ernie hadn't told the jury, and for the defence, they were doozies. Firstly, Ernie said it wasn't only Ross that Darcy had ripped off in the drug deal that got him killed. Ernie said his fellow Crown witness Gordon and another inmate I'm calling David had been ripped off as well. And what's more, according to Ernie at least, Gordon and David helped Ross commit the murder by standing in front of prison guard Jim Stedman, blocking his view while Darcy was attacked. And finally, Ernie said, after all this happened, Gordon threatened him not once, but twice. While Ernie was in the showers, he said Gordon pushed him up against the taps.
Gordon said, "What's your step today?" I went very tense over this and I said, "You got nothing to worry about."
And Gordon later confronted Ernie in the kitchen.
I was doing the dishes again when I was approached by Gordon. He was sharpening his butcher's knife. He did not threaten me, but the inference was that of a threat. He said to me, "Keep my mouth tight," or, you know.
This was a remarkable revelation, and when I read it, I couldn't quite believe it. The Crown's main witness was accusing the other Crown witness of involvement in the murder. Ross's lawyer, Mary Beth Sharp, also thought it was kind of astounding. Here's how she described it during that Radio Pacific interview in 1989.
It was nonsensical that you could have one witness saying that he had been threatened by his fellow witness who was giving evidence for the Crown against Ross Appelgren, because it meant that the two of them couldn't possibly, if you like, in simple terms, have been on the same side at the time.
Sharp incorporated this new evidence into Ross's appeal grounds. Though, as she said in her submissions, she still wasn't convinced police had handed over all of Ernie and Gordon's statements to detectives. She also argued Justice Vautier's summing up to the jury was unfair, as were his criticisms of Jim Stedman's testimony. Her final ground relied on a new witness for the defence. An inmate had come forward after the trial to say the Crown's witness, Gordon, had exaggerated his evidence. It all sounded promising for Ross, but those who know the justice system know nothing happens quickly. Ross was convicted in July 1985, but it wasn't until the end of that year that Sharp was able to file his appeal. While he waited, Ross just had to count down the days.
As they say within the walls, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. But to face life, or for that matter any sentence, knowing that you are not guilty of any crime is one of the hardest tests I've ever had to face.
The pressure became too much. Ross decided to make a break for it.
Tell me, what can you recall about the day that Ross tried to escape?
Oh, bloody, quite a lot.
That's former Parry prison guard Hone Horaki.
I was only there, brought in at the last moment to help with the escort. I wasn't the escorting officer, And I was walking out the door when the OC said, "Mr. Horaki, you want a little bit of overtime?"
That overtime was escorting Ross on a trip outside the wire to see his optometrist.
Couldn't fucking see a thing, mate. That's why he was going down there to get a change of glasses.
The date was the 3rd of September 1985. Ross had not long been locked up for the murder of Darcy, about 6 weeks. The appointment was in Browns Bay on Auckland's North Shore.
The criteria for Parry, when you do escorts, you must always be a minimum 3 officers plus a driver.
Right.
Yeah, that's the maximum requirement because of the status of the inmates,
Ross's vision wasn't great, but he could see this was as good a time as any to have a crack at freedom.
There was normally 2 of our old fellas that are on the verge of retirement.
Outrunning them would be easy, Ross thought. But as they say, the best laid plans often go awry. A young and quick Hone Horaki joined the escort at the last minute.
But the only thing he said they didn't anticipate, he said, I didn't anticipate was this little bloody Mary officer, He said, I knew I could get away from these buggers and it'll take the majors to get me, and I had to just go up here and I would have been fine.
But as the prison van trundled off from Parry that afternoon, Ross realised if he wanted out, he'd have to stick with his scheme. His first stroke, only stroke of luck, came when they arrived at the optometrist.
When you escort an inmate, the van, you're supposed to reverse the back up to the entrance, and there's only one way in, one way out.
Though on this occasion, Hone says one of the senior guards decided they didn't need to follow normal protocol. Instead, they parked the van about 25 metres from the entrance to the clinic and let Ross walk over.
So he just said, because he'd already dealt with him a couple of times, that he said, no, it'll be fine. And
without any handcuffs?
No, without any handcuffs, yes.
Big mistake. When his appointment finished, Ross exited and started to slowly walk back towards the prison van.
I could see his actual feet pick up, you see. He started to pick up, and the problem was that they would have brought the van up to the entrance, but they left it in the car park, and he started starting to run. I thought, oh, shit, I think this guy's going to bloody run.
Hone saw Ross throw aside his glasses and bolt.
And as he went around the back, the other two looked at me and I said, where you going? I said, you fellas go that way, I'll go that way.
Hone cornered Ross and lined him up.
He was looking at me and he saw me coming and said, I got you, bro. I got you, because he was running at pace. Of course, I said, that was probably the worst thing he could have done, because I'm a senior A rugby player, eh? I was playing for Army, you know? And he goes, straight at me, and I just felt like into a rugby tackle, and I just put him down.
After Hone heaved Ross into the prison van, he had just one question. Why on earth did Ross stop to remove his glasses?
He said, I don't know why I chucked my glasses down. John, it's because I couldn't see anything, eh? He said, but I just fucking ran. I just said, fuck, this is my chance. I chucked it down. He said, for the like of me, I don't know why. And he said, I didn't know where I was going.
For flooring Ross in a textbook rugby tackle, Hone got a commendation from the Justice Department. For his efforts, Ross got a spell in the pound.
The pound. The digger. In other words, solitary confinement.
Ross's Court of Appeal hearing finally went ahead on the 16th of June 1986. We've had an actor read some of Mary Beth Sharp's written submissions. She zeroed in on Ernie's claim that Gordon was involved in Darcy's death and that he'd pressured Ernie to keep his mouth shut.
It is submitted that if the defence had been able to impugn Gordon's evidence by cross-examining him as to the threats in the shower, his credibility would have been severely shaken. More important is the possibility that by showing that Ernie had omitted from evidence matters of substance involving Gordon, having first mentioned them to the police prior to trial, he may in fact have been protecting Gordon. That would make the evidence of both these witnesses highly suspect.
Gordon, perhaps not surprisingly, denied Ernie's claims. And the appeal judges, well, in their ruling, they didn't think it was material either way.
There often will be inconsistencies between statements made by a witness to the police and what he says in his evidence. Whether these omissions can be said to be material will largely be a question of degree. We are satisfied that against the present background in which the statements were made, neither matter can be said to be so material as to have obliged the Crown to disclose the statements to the defence in advance of or during the trial. Application for leave to appeal against conviction is refused.
When I read this decision, I was pretty surprised the court didn't make more of Ernie's claims about Gordon. It certainly throws up a lot of questions that I thought the judges would have wanted to explore. Like, why was Gordon never charged? I mean, if the cops believed Ernie when he said Ross committed the murder, why didn't they believe him when he said Gordon helped Ross do it? I've seen no proof he was ever investigated by police over it.
Was it acceptable to you that they...
No. And they should have. Why didn't they?
And this lack of attention on Gordon also bothers Darcy's widow, Suzanne Young.
I'm only speculating, but what if the reason they didn't want to investigate Gordon was that would undermine how he was seen by the jury, and they wanted to use Gordon to get Appelgren, and that was the reason they didn't investigate him?
Possibly.
Are you okay with that, if that was the strategy?
No, not really. Because why? That's just hiding.
At the very least, would you have liked to have been consulted on that decision as the wife?
I think I should have been told a lot more, yes.
Yeah.
There had to be more than one person.
Someone, like Gordon, to distract the on-duty guard. Back in 1985, before Ross's trial, police's main witness, Ernie, also urged them to charge Gordon as an accessory and to seriously doubt the statement Gordon had given detectives.
Gordon has probably done a lot of jail and now knows he could be in more trouble, so naturally he wants not to be involved and of course will put a good story across.
But as we know, prosecutors and police went along with what Gordon told them.
Of course it's worthy of scrutiny. Why is that so? Why was something like that put to one side?
That's Tim McKinnell, the investigator working on the appeal to overturn Ross's conviction.
The simple answer is likely to be it wasn't helpful to the prosecution. Why wasn't it helpful to the prosecution? Did they need that witness?
So it's possible they decided his
ability to implicate Appelgren was worth more than him being held accountable possibly as a party to murder.
That's right.
Tim says usually if police want to secure crucial evidence of an offender against another, prosecutors can agree to not charge them in return for their evidence. The legal term for it is being offered immunity from prosecution.
Yeah, well, that's right. That would have been the appropriate way to deal with it. Let the evidence all out, and if you need to manage the legal risk for one or more of your witnesses, you do that through the proper channels.
Of course, that's not what happened with Gordon.
Each of these troubling features is something that needs to be looked at holistically on a review of this case.
So then I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell? I'm in here doing life for nothing. And what can I do about it?
Back in 1986, Ross struggled to make sense of his failed appeal.
I realised that it was one thing to use the fire of anger to keep my spirits up, and another to become bitter. Sometimes, though, when I thought about those who had told lies, and those in authority who had known about those lies, bitterness was hard to keep at bay.
Disillusioned with the outcome, his lawyer Mary Beth Sharp gave up criminal defence work altogether. Here she is describing her decision to Tim Bickerstaff on Radio Pacific.
When I finished the appeal, I felt that there was nothing more usefully that I could do for Ross because I had been involved with it for too long, I was too close to it, and it needed a fresh mind.
It meant Ross was on his own. If there's anything a life sentence gives you plenty of, it is spare time. Ross figured if the court wasn't going to properly examine what happened, he'd have to do it himself.
I buried myself into my case. I started writing a few letters. I got Mary Beth Sharp to send down some papers. I went through some statements, trying to find something, but I didn't even know what I was doing. To the Registrar, Court of Appeal. Dear Sir, I am writing to you requesting a copy of the memorandum and submissions made by counsel for the Crown. To the Superintendent, I'm again requesting, under the Official Information Act, any reports, notes, etc. in connection to the homicide which took place. Thanking you, Ross Appelgren.
The records Ross particularly wanted to see were those hidden statements he was sure Ernie and Gordon had given police. Throughout 1986 and early 1987, Ross sent off several requests to the police. He got plenty of acknowledgements.
Receipt is acknowledged of your letter dated 16 February 1987 in which you seek information.
Inquiries are being made into this matter and you will be contacted again at the earliest opportunity.
Though not much else.
Your request for official information has been referred to the Crown Solicitor Office for actioning.
I found that I could make no headway.
But as would happen a lot to Ross on the road ahead, just when he thought all was lost, Lady Luck intervened. Well, actually her name was Rosemary Wilson, a Radio Pacific talkback host who became one of Ross's biggest supporters. She also ended up as a co-author with Ross on the unpublished memoir you've heard extracts of in this podcast. Rosemary sadly died several years ago. But in 1989, she appeared on her own network with host Tim Bickerstaff to discuss Ross's case and describe how she met him.
Well, I guess it started when, during the midnight to dawn show, as you know, Tim, you get a lot of callers from people who've been in prison in their time, and they're not actually allowed to call from prison. And they give you one view of events, and then you get a lot of people who describe it as a luxury hotel, and they give you another. So in about June 1986, I thought I'd better find out, and I went up to Parry to spend the day having a look over the prison and seeing if I could suss it out for myself to see what the threat was, I guess. And I spent the day doing that.
Ross was by then working as a cook in the kitchen at Parry.
And I was invited to join the officers in the mess that night, which I did. And my dinner was cooked by a couple of guys in whites and brought to the table. And afterwards they joined us at the table and we were talking. And it was only when one of the prison officers sort of said, "Okay, guys, lock-up time," that I realised that the gentleman I'd been talking to for an hour was a prison inmate and not a prison officer, which probably shows how dumb I am.
The inmate Rosemary chatted to turned out to be Ross.
After he'd gone away, one of the prison officers, and this was perhaps the first time I heard about all the support, I said to him, "Good heavens, I had no idea." And he said, "Oh, yep, not only that, he's on a murder rap." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yep, but he shouldn't be."
So you got pretty interested in it all then?
Well, I wasn't particularly interested at that stage, but I dropped him a note saying thanks for cooking the dinner because I thought that the conversation had been a bit truncated.
Ross wrote back, and soon Rosemary was hooked.
His appeal had gone wrong, and foolishly, and heaven help me, added probably something along the lines of if there's ever anything I can do to help. But a little while later, I found documents which could have been buried in him ever since.
Rosemary also happened to be close friends with former Justice Minister and defence lawyer Martin Finlay QC. Finlay had himself successfully defended an inmate accused of murder. We've mentioned this case briefly before. The inmate was Cedric James, and Finlay got him acquitted after he was accused of killing Keith Hall in Parry in 1979. Anyway, Rosemary asked Finlay to look at Ross's trial documents.
Martin looked them over. He was a bit concerned about them too, felt there were a few things that were not right and proper.
These people who questioned Ross's guilt, Rosemary, the officer at her lunch, and now her friend Martin Finlay, well, they weren't alone.
I felt that the guy was hard done by, and I felt that the guy was innocent of what he'd been convicted of.
Dominic Malcolm was a Pāremoremo guard when Ross did time there in the 1990s.
Was he known to be violent?
Violent? Never. No, not at all. He didn't make any threats that I had seen anyway, for sure. And I was very comfortable being around Ross Appelgren.
It was said that, he wasn't the guy. He was not the guy. And, and if you were to ask me, from what I knew of the guy, I don't think he was capable of doing it.
That's Hone Hauraki again, who literally helped flatten Ross's escape attempt in September 1985.
Violent guy?
Nah, listen, bro, if you were to look at his makeup, if you saw his makeup and the way he was, you would not, even you or anybody would look at him and say, bro, he doesn't strike me that he's, capable of doing what they reckon he did.
But what about Mount Eden prison staff? Those who were there when the murder happened? Like Mark Anthony.
Were you aware of any instances where he was violent towards other prisoners or staff?
No, he just wanted to do his own thing. Never, in the whole time that I knew him and dealing with him and that sort of side of things, there was no incidents that I could even think of him even raising his voice to anybody. He was just so easygoing.
What was staff reaction to Appelgren being arrested for the murder?
Basically, the talk that I was listening to was that it was highly unlikely that he would have done it. It's just not in his behaviour.
Were there any staff members that believed Appelgren was responsible?
No.
Then there's the former Mount Eden guard we call him James. He was one of the last staff members to see Darcy alive. He also knew Ross.
I would say I was surprised that he was supposedly the person who did it.
Unfortunately, Jim Stedman, the guard in the kitchen when Darcy was killed, died in 2018. As far as I can tell, he was never asked by police or in court if he thought Ross was guilty. However, Stedman's Mount Eden colleague and close friend Paul Lobb told me he had asked Jim that very question.
I remember Jimmy saying he didn't do it.
And to the best of your recollection, do you know whether that was based on Jim's first-hand knowledge or something he'd heard?
Well, I'm not sure, but he was quite adamant.
Ross Appelgren wasn't involved?
Yeah.
The other Mount Eden staffer who had an important role in the police investigation was the Chief Prison Officer, Errol Dyer. He was the one who received Ernie's anonymous notes the day after the murder. Dyer gave evidence at both of Ross's trials, but also was not asked if he thought Ross was guilty. He told me by email he didn't remember much about the pedal or its movements. He didn't even have a very distinct memory of receiving Ernie's notes. But with respect to Ross, Dyer didn't think he was responsible for Darcy's murder. He said it just wasn't in Ross's nature to do something like that. And he said the Ross he knew was not a violent person. It's striking to me that not a single one of the prison staff I spoke to who knew Ross Appelgren before or after the murder thought he actually did it. How usual is that?
So, did you ever know of any prison guards that did think Ross was responsible?
Not that I'm aware of, bro.
That's me speaking with Hone Hauraki again.
And is that unusual?
Oh, it's unusual, because You know, there's one thing, officers are pretty instinctive of inmates, eh?
Would Ross be one of the only cases that you're aware of that a good number of prison guards would think that his conviction is wrong?
Yeah, absolutely, bro. Absolutely.
So the consensus seemed to be that, okay, sure, Ross was a career criminal, but he wasn't a killer. Of course, that's also the way Ross presented himself to TV3 journalist Keith Davies in this 1992 interview.
You haven't led a pure life, have you, Ross?
No, I haven't.
And you're portrayed as a likeable rogue. But you stole from people. You tried to rob a bank.
Yeah, well, I did rob a bank, but I paid for it too. I got 8 years for it.
A lifetime of crime.
Yeah.
Are you a bad person?
Some people most probably think I am, but I don't think so. I've never hurt anybody physically.
Okay, that's not strictly true. Ross had one conviction for assault in 1969 when he was 18. And he did do that armed bank robbery, which is a big deal. But interestingly, Ross's prison file, which is almost 1,000 pages long, covering his decades inside, never mentions any serious violence, except, of course, the murder of Darcy Tahira. Then again, not everything that happens in prison is officially recorded. According to his own memoir, Ross, like many inmates, had his fair share of scraps.
Tempers flare very easily in prison. It always amazes me to see just how little it takes. There are all sorts of reasons. I recall Ben, a good mate still, but when we first met it wasn't so. Both of us worked in the kitchen. One day an argument developed. I don't remember what it was about, but we were both angry. I remember thinking, this guy looks capable, I better watch it, and decided to get in the first punch. Wham! He didn't move, and the next minute I was getting punched all around the kitchen. Bunny, another mate, saw that I was in a no-win situation and on the wrong end, so he suggested that enough was enough. Nursing a few bruises, but very hurt pride-wise, I went off to lick my wounds.
But perhaps Ross had a darker side known only to prisoners, hidden from view by the inmate's code of silence, and one he didn't describe in his memoir. So I asked some guys who did time with Ross.
Oh, g'day, Brian.
G'day, how are you?
Good, yourself?
Yeah, pretty good.
This former inmate, who just wants to be known as Brian, was in Parry with Ross for around 18 months. To a generation of prison officers, cops and robbers, Brian is a familiar figure.
I was in prison from 1963 to 1984. I would have had about 3 years out free.
What was the type of offending that you became synonymous with?
I was always safe-cracking until late in the day when I got in tow with a couple of armed bandits, you know, and did a few armed robberies.
If not a household name, Brian was definitely well known in the big house.
Can you give a ballpark estimate? How many safes do you think you cracked in your career?
I did 5 in one night, 3 in one building. I know how many I did, 22. But I mostly used to get supermarkets because that's where the cash was.
That daring, safe-cracking bandit is now a retiree living the quiet life in Christchurch.
Did you say you got 5 chihuahuas?
Yes, yeah, well, I have 5 with me all day, and when I go into work 2 or 3 days a week, they all come.
Back in his heyday, though, it wasn't chihuahuas Brian was spending most of his time with. It was murderers, druggies and armed robbers like Ross, or Roscoe, as Brian called him.
I knew him quite well, Roscoe. I knew him from working in the kitchen. He came to work in the kitchen in Verumo. Roscoe was always a bit wide-eyed and credulous of the honesty of the most dishonest people. He looked up to the wrong people, and he thought you could trust everybody by what they said or how they appeared to be, and he wouldn't tell on anyone. That's why we liked him. You know, I could say the guys that were running the place, we always liked Roscoe because we knew he was solid.
Then Brian said something that surprised me.
Roscoe was not cut out to be in prison. Roscoe was too naive to be a crook. You know, he's one of those guys that can't possibly succeed because it's not his nature. You know, it was unnatural for him to be a crook. I think it was his environment that made him like that, you know.
Did you see Ross get kind of taken advantage of or have people like basically screw him over in prison?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I can remember speaking to a couple of guys and telling them to fucking lay off him, you know. Ross wasn't a pushy guy at all in any way. You know, he was in the prison situation. I wouldn't say he was meek and mild. He had courage, but he just didn't have that it, you know.
Did you ever see people try and pick a fight with him?
Yeah, I did actually. A couple of times I spoke up for him and said, like, leave him alone, because I was the head cook, you know, and I used to keep peace in the place. And, you know, I could fight a bit.
Given all that, you can guess Brian doesn't think the Ross he knew was a murderer.
I suppose I could say I'm an expert at assessing criminal personalities. I've known all the worst and the best over all those years, and he is outstandingly the most innocent one that I've ever known.
He almost seemed like he was accidentally in prison.
That's another Brian McDonald, who we met earlier in this series. He was also in Parry with Ross in the 1980s while serving his own sentence for murder. Brian had plenty of experience sizing up other inmates like Ross.
He was a friendly sort of guy. He was not somebody that you felt threatened around or that was necessarily going to, you know, turn on you in some way. So, you know, he was a nice guy to sort of know, I guess you would say. In maximum security, he wasn't a comfortable fit. He tried to be, and he did mix well with others and so forth, but generally just got the impression that he was in the wrong place, basically.
What is your thoughts on knowing Ross as you did, on him being the type of person to essentially beat somebody to death with a wooden paddle?
Oh, I just wouldn't imagine it. I just couldn't imagine. I've never seen any indication, no fire in his eyes in certain situations, no quick rising anger or anything like that. And of course in maximum security you do have to sort of keep a bit of an eye out for yourself and be aware of others, but Ross would not be one of the guys that you'd be concerned about.
But among the ex-cons I spoke to for this podcast, there was one that did believe Ross was capable of doing what he was convicted of. And unexpectedly, it was Ross's friend, Greg Newbold.
Ross wasn't a violent guy at all. He had values and would stick up for the prisoner social code, but he never got into a fight during the years that I knew him at Paramarimal.
But, and this is the important point, Greg says it was Ross's unflinching commitment to the code that meant he would have been prepared to act completely out of character.
If Darcy Tahira had ripped him off, which was what the police case was, owed him some money for some marijuana, and Tahira was due to get out, Ross would have been honour bound to retaliate. It's called backing up. And part of the prisoner social code is that you don't allow people to rip you off and you back up. If someone had ripped Ross off, I would expect him to back up because that's the rule. If he'd been ripped off and hadn't backed up, he would have gone down in the prisoner hierarchy and that would have meant a lot to him.
While Ross was back in Parry, Ernie was back in Christchurch finalising his future. He didn't mess around. Within just 4 days of Ross's guilty verdict, Ernie had changed his name. The next thing he wanted sorted was early release from his prison sentence, which wasn't set to finish until the end of 1986. Remember, since June of 1985, Ernie had lived in the community in taxpayer-funded accommodation, first in the motel and then in a rental. Police said this was because Ernie's life had been threatened and it was too dangerous to return him to jail. Not able to work, Ernie got by on $150 a week from social welfare and police, though he called it a miserable amount. To formalise Ernie's prison release, justice officials determined that this could be authorised by the Justice Minister Geoffrey Palmer under existing legislation. It seemed that the controversial law change we heard about in an earlier episode wasn't required after all. So, in October 1985, with the support of the Police Minister Anne Herkis, Justice Minister Geoffrey Palmer authorised Ernie's release on temporary parole. His parole conditions weren't particularly onerous. All he had to do was report weekly, behave well, and, quote, commit no offence against the law. He signed the parole document, knowing if he did not carry out these conditions, he could be arrested and his temporary release rescinded. Police were also relieved at this development. It meant they could finally downscale Operation Icing, their 24/7 watch on Ernie. All up, it had cost more than $75,000, making it the most expensive operation of its kind to date in New Zealand history. Ernie, though, was still required to check in weekly with police until he was released on full parole in July 1986. Unfortunately for Ernie, and perhaps not uncommon for fraudsters, he had some big debts still waiting to pounce. There was the 73 grand he'd stolen, which had landed him in Mount Eden in the first place.
Well, his previous employer was taking a civil action against him to recover the money he stole.
That's former journalist Keith Davies. He reported on Ernie's long list of liabilities.
And social welfare still wanted to obtain $8,000 in outstanding maintenance obligations, a debt the police later arranged to have wiped.
By means that aren't entirely clear, it appears all Ernie's debts were sorted. But even with that burden lifted, and despite agreeing in writing to commit no more offences, Ernie did, well, what Ernie did.
On 30 May 1986, he went into town shopping. Because he is not earning any money and just living on the dole, he finds meeting expenses very difficult. As a result, he fell short of money.
Now, okay, Ernie was on the dole, but remember, police were paying his rent, power, and telephone bills.
He became very depressed and has had difficulty sleeping.
As I read this, it struck me that the detective writing this report sounded less like a cop and more like Ernie's defence lawyer.
On this date, he went into Christchurch and into a department store. There, he removed 2 pairs of socks valued at $17.98 and placed them under his jacket, and after looking around the shop, decided to leave the shop without paying for the 2 items.
An eagle-eyed security guard spotted Ernie and caught him red-handed. Police were called, but with Ernie's friends in high places, he got let off the theft charge.
He was warned by me in no uncertain terms that any further action of that nature would be treated very seriously.
All this happened less than 6 weeks before Ross's appeal. And you guessed it, neither Ross, nor his lawyers, nor the court was informed. It was hardly the crime of the century, but Ernie's continued offending, in breach of his parole conditions to boot, was undoubtedly relevant to his credibility, which was what the whole Crown case against Ross rested on. Back in 1986, Ernie was keen to escape the chilly confines of Christchurch. But with more than 200 fraud convictions to his name, it wasn't going to be easy. Ernie wanted to go to Australia, so New Zealand police wrote to the Aussie authorities on his behalf, seeking a special exemption. But the Aussies said no. Here's Keith Davies again.
Brian C. Bates of the Australian Federal Police, who wrote, "I regret to have to advise you that your request for relocation and residence in Australia for Ernie has been refused by the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs. My personal representations were made with considerable persuasion and perseverance, however. Ernie's case does not satisfy the entry residence criteria in a number of areas. DIEA have been particularly resolute, and further negotiation is, in my opinion, not likely to change the decision."
A setback, but nothing another name change wouldn't fix. According to Ernie, with his second new name confirmed, he obtained a passport and, using the $30,000 he'd received from the cops, got himself across the ditch sometime in 1987. Now, if you're thinking, wait a second, how was Ernie able to get into Australia having earlier been denied entry? And did the New Zealand police just stand by and let him do it? Well, those are very good questions, which I'm going to explore in a later episode. For now, I want to go back a little, because of all Ernie's final negotiations with police, the most difficult to resolve was the money. Remember, in May 1985, police initially agreed to pay Ernie $5 grand. But after the trial, Ernie wanted more. Much more. A remarkable tussle ensued, Ernie and his lawyer Chambers on one side, and police top brass on the other. Eventually, government ministers were also sucked into the fray. The first thing I'll say struck me reading through all of these documents was that both parties described the proposed payment to Ernie as being not just for relocation and resettlement, but also as a reward. Ernie called it a reward. Police records described the payment in 5 different places as a reward. But perhaps most significantly, the paperwork for Ernie's final payment described it as, quote, a final reward and settlement amount. To me, and perhaps you, that clearly indicated the money wasn't just about Ernie's personal safety, as detectives originally claimed. Following the trial, Ernie fired the first shot, writing to Police National Headquarters with his new demands.
I would request 70,000 New Zealand dollars plus 2 months free accommodation minimal. All I want is an adequate start to a life and a future with security in which to work.
No way, said the police, who suggested a figure between 35 and 45k could be looked at. This was an amount supported by the head of the Darcy Tahira murder inquiry, Peter Jenkinson. In an August 1986 letter to his superiors, he wrote,
"This sum is reasonable. The bottom line in regard to the murder of Tahira is that without the evidence of Ernie, Ross Appelgren would not have been convicted."
Ernie seemed to realise his own importance as well, so he counter-offered.
I'm very angry with that figure, as I know even that will be knocked. I want nothing less than $50,000 now.
Then police played hardball, perhaps none too pleased at feeling they were being hustled. They stripped their offer down to just $15,300. An internal police report explained this was consistent with the top amounts paid in similar cases. Ernie was now really upset. In September 1986, Roger Chambers wrote to both the Justice Minister and Police Minister seeking their urgent intervention and calling the latest police proposal
totally unacceptable. Indeed, my client views as I do the present situation as bordering on a failure to honour oft-stated promises. A crisis situation now presents, and it is imperative that the matter is discussed with you forthwith.
Palmer told Chambers he wouldn't get involved as it was a police matter. So back the lawyer went to bargain with detectives. Finally, in late November 1986, an agreement was reached. I actually have a copy of the contract Ernie signed with the police commissioner. That's really unusual in itself. While there have definitely been police deals with informants, no one I've spoken to within the legal system, that's lawyers and judges, no one had ever seen the actual documentation. Ernie's contract was simple. Only 2 pages. It confirms police paid Ernie $30,000, which is not bad at all, given it was twice the going rate for similar cases and nearly $85,000 in today's money. Police also agreed to cover Ernie's legal fees of more than $10,000. But the generosity didn't stop there. Ernie went from having owed social welfare $8,000 to having them agree to pay him a weekly allowance of $170 for a 2-month period. The deal was done, with no strings attached. Ernie left New Zealand with no intention of looking back. He hoped Ross would accept his fate and do his time so everyone could put this grisly chapter behind them. Well, Ernie was wrong. Because no one told Ross that.
I dropped, grabbed my bag, ran to the fence line, cut a hole and took off across the fields.
It's 7:45. Let's take a look at the daily newspapers now.
Good morning. Police are hunting an escaped killer from Kaitoki prison in Wanganui yesterday.
That's all coming up on the next episode of Nark. Thanks for listening to Nark, hosted and written by me, Mike Wesley-Smith. I'm also extremely grateful to everyone who spoke with me for this podcast, especially Suzanne Young and Julia Appelgren. And if anyone listening has more information about this case, I'd be keen to hear from you. Send an email to nark@rnz.co.nz. Follow and listen to Nark wherever you get your podcasts, and if you've enjoyed it, use the share button to recommend it to a friend. Some more quick thank yous to Ngā Taonga and Mediaworks for some of the archival audio, and to the voice actors who helped bring some of the characters in this episode to life. Craig Genty, Nigel Collins, Kate Newton, Stephen Parker, Abby Garton, Will Plummer, Amanda Gillies, Felix Walton, Finn Blackwell and Matthew Hutching. The RNZ producers who worked on this episode were Liz Garton, William Ray, Duncan Smith and Justin Gregory. Alex Harmer was the audio engineer. Thanks also to Steve Burridge and Jeremy Ansell for the studio wrangling, and to Kevin Golding for opening the doors to me every week after hours. Graphics were designed by Amrita Marks, and the shorthand page, where you can find more information on this story, was made by Hingyi Kong. Check it out at rnz.co.nz/nark. Tim Watkin is RNZ's Executive Editor Audio, and Brianna Uritich-Gregg is the Production Coordinator. You can find more of RNZ's great podcasts like Paifiri on the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz/podcasts. Check them out. Bye for now.